dang complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. Like talking about blue, red, man. Then you get to one side, and like messed up.
If you share my lack of faith in our health system, you should take control of your well-being. Building resilience and maintaining good health for the long term needs to be a priority. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching offers one-stop expert advice on training, diet, and lifestyle. You can purchase customized workout plans for strength training or structured exercise. If you're serious about maximizing your potential, you can book time with a coach or customize your routine and get video feedback on your performance. I know the owner, and he's one of us. Visit Axios and support those who support the show. Follow the link in the description to become a man of action with Axios. No one blames you for being weak, but it's your fault if you stay that way. All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing quite well, man. Thank you for hosting me.
So you and I normally avoid topics from the headlines, right? We normally kind of talk about, eternal matters, a little bit of history, philosophy, politics, things like that. But we're here today to discuss something that, I think is one of the biggest news stories of the last half decade, if not more. And that is the indictment of President Trump. So if you could you explain, the bare bones, facts of the case, so to speak, and then why it matters, why it's important?
I mean, frankly, the substance of the indictment is not so much what's important. The timing of it is what appears very suspicious. And when I say suspicious, I mean, as regards, an inference being drawn of malicious prosecution. And when we're talking about malicious prosecution, we're not talking about literally, sworn facts being alleged that are perjurous, although sometimes that's the case, or a fact pattern that substantiate the indictment or information that's totally confabulated. Although again, sometimes that's in the most extreme cases that's true. Whether charges are brought or not against any defendant, I mean, there is a discretionary aspect to that. I mean, that's why state's attorneys are I mean, they're an elected official, entrusted with executive power for that reason. There is a political aspect to it, not just in terms of what's prioritized in terms of enforcement of the law, in terms of public safety and general police power, but also there's a kind of restraint that needs to be that needs to reign within kind of the culture of the office. And I don't really see that here. There's a problem anytime, and this was the problem with Ken Starr, okay? Like, even if you think Clinton was a total piece of shit, Bill Clinton, and I mean, I certainly do, and he was a disaster for this country. I've literally got nothing nice to say about him, but Ken Starr, the special prosecutor, who kind of relentlessly hounded Clinton, he actually made Clinton a sympathetic figure because it was clear that Ken Starr was a man who he commenced an investigation of a man and then went outward to see what he could charge that man with. And that's not how due process works. Now people will say things like, oh, but what if he uncovers a crime? Still, that's not how due process works. You don't, the kind of executive police power, and particularly the discretionary authority to prosecute, it doesn't exist so that we can just kind of put public figures under surveillance and see what kind of dirt we can find on them. I mean, that's really, you're talking about an inquisition in the most charitable interpretation of that is that it's a kind of inquisition. In the most punitive terms, it's just what I said. It's a nakedly political act that's attempting to alter the outcome of political processes or to restrict the field of potential contestants to an election or an incumbency by removing them from candidacy under color of law enforcement or something. I mean, so that's the issue. The issue with malicious prosecution, particularly of a public figure, is you really kind of have to ask yourself, would this defendant be under indictment were he not who he is? And it's obvious that that's no. The answer is no. I mean, frankly, I think the regime lost what any remaining credibility it had, when it when it tried to impeach Trump as a sitting president. I mean, that's an extraordinary remedy, and it's not the impeachment power. It's not some kind of it's not some kind of veto power that Congress has over an executive they don't like. I mean, and there's something to it, when Trump's constantly saying this is the way third world countries do things. I mean, Trump says a lot of stupid things, but that actually isn't a stupid thing. He's absolutely right. This kind of you know, you've got a deep state element that's literally pulling out all stops to remove a sitting president or to prevent a candidate from the ability to stand for election, and they're claiming that oh, he's committing crimes, or oh, this is a criminal investigation. There's something very cynical about it, but there's also something primitive. There's something just cringe about it. Like that's not really the way you do things in developed societies, because it's not, anybody who's got even a rudimentary understanding of due process and what that entails, and kind of what even somebody who has like even a limited understanding of kind of the applied aspects of the law, like, realizes what's underway there. And I mean, that kind of thing breeds contempt for authority. And if you're which I mean, I don't particularly care if this regime, like, cultivates contempt for itself. If anything, that's probably a net positive in historical terms. But my point is that it's really it's really kind of a shameful exhibition. However anybody feels about Trump, like, Trump the man's not important here. Just like I said, the whole spectacle of Ken Starr in the in '98 was pretty grotesque, and I thought that even as a very young man, and I was somebody who utterly despised Bill Clinton and all that he represented. So I mean, that's kind of that's the key issue, or why why this should be on anybody's radar, like, even if they're like a dissident partisan, who's not doesn't feel at all invested in these outcomes. Trump. I'm going to give it over to you in a minute, and we'll get further into the person of Trump, because that's what underlies this entire charade. But Trump's a tremendously significant personage, whatever anybody thinks about him, and whether or not you think Trump has gravitas or not, like, that doesn't matter. It's what he represents, and the degree to which he's become literally a prime symbol of the fracturing of what remained of the political consensus in America. Like I said right before we went live, the kind of vector, the entire vector of policy domestically, whether obliquely or whether very directly and in those kind of way, like, orbits around Trump, or at least, like, what Trump represents to the 70 million people who voted for him. And it doesn't, the fact Trump isn't really right wing, or the fact he's not, the fact he's basically like a TV personality, that's not important. If 70 million people say you're something, like, that's what you are. Like, it didn't matter that Nixon wasn't some right wing firebrand, or like, the second coming of George Wallace. But the fact that the entire Wallace coalition, like, went for Nixon, there really was a silent majority. And the fact that Nixon was their guy, that was a tremendously significant socio-political phenomenon. And that's also why the deep state came to hate Nixon, even though Nixon wasn't really, in principle terms, like, they couldn't even really point to, like, why they hated Nixon, or like why his policy was supposedly horrible. I mean, like, Nixon actually was a historical giant, but I mean, it's also beyond that, though. It's not like he was some, like, arch right winger. Nixon actually, the reason why the big, like, Greater Chicagoland Forest Preserve, like, by my house, is Nixon Woods, Like Nixon did a huge amount of stuff for the EPA. He did a huge amount of stuff for like conservationist efforts. He put an end to forced busing, but he was huge in, you know, like civil rights oriented stuff, like you know, like basically like giving massive subsidies, you know, to like businesses and universities that, you know, had like the correct like minority quota and stuff. Like the idea that, and plus, I mean, I mean, in those days, you know, the Republican Party was viewed as you know, the party of the military industrial complex. I mean, what did Nixon do? Like Nixon literally put the brakes on the Cold War. I mean, he did it in the wake of a strategic masterstroke by which he really kind of cut the knees off of Warsaw Pact by decoupling them from China. But the point is, it's like, you know, this is what the left was always saying, like, was their ambition. And, you know, the last man they had in office was LBJ, you know, who like escalated the war in Southeast Asia to disastrous proportions. You know, like Nixon stopped all that. Like, if anything, like moderates, you know, should have thought Nixon was the man, but it didn't matter. That was, you know, the reality of Nixonian policy, and his whole policy paradigm. Like, what mattered was what he represented, you know, to tens of millions of people. And, you know, that burgeoning consciousness of a kind of, you know, a truly like white majoritarian voting bloc was something that horrified the enemy. So there you have it. I realized there was a lot in there, but that's
So one of the things that I've found interesting in this is the big question of the Biden administration was, are we going to quote unquote go back to normal, right? Was Trump essentially an exception? Like, we hate Trump, we have to get rid of him. But after that, we're going to kind of, you know, let the Trump coalition settle. You know, we'll stop poking him in the eye. We'll maybe throw him a bone or two. And that didn't happen. And to me, I look at that as a mistake. If your aim is to keep hold on power, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not sustainable at all. You can't take 70 or 80 million people and say like, oh, these people are bad, or these people aren't, you know, they're outside the quote mainstream of political life, or, you know, they don't hold, or they're quote deplorables who don't, you know, hold values that we consider to be morally acceptable. You know, you can say that about, you know, like the people who like went for Wallace in the Solid South, but even that was like a stretch, because you're talking about, you know, like 3 or 4 like states that have the potential collectively to like swing elections. You can't say that about literally half the country. And or I guess you can, but you're left then with no mandate to rule. And, you know, Biden would be like a pretend executive, even if the guy wasn't just like a pathetic old queen. And like I mean, even before Biden was senile, he was like utterly fucking pathetic. Like, the guy's like literally a fucking clown. But even if Biden was not, you know, the kind of American Cherenenko, you can't carve a mandate out of saying we hate half of the country, you know. And it's like, even that's something people understood even amidst you know, that it's hard to overstate the degree to which people were hostile to Reagan, especially during Reagan's first term. Like, Reagan's remembered as this guy with this like incredible mandate, you know, like on order of like FDR, or like, you know, or was beloved like Kennedy or something. He was not at all. I mean, Reagan was the great communicator, because he really did like ossify and expand that silent majority coalition. But like about a third of the electorate like hated Reagan. Like, they hated Reagan like trunk derangement losers like hate Trump. But they also understood, you know, even with an objectively hostile Congress that they controlled, like, they realized like, we got to do business with this man. I mean, part of that was the Cold War backdrop, where, you know, their existential survival was, you know, on the table. But part of it was just like the pragmatic business of government. Like, you can't like permanently gridlocking policy by saying, you know, our only platform is we hate Reagan because he's evil. Like, that wouldn't have even occurred to anybody. So it's kind of like a burgeoning like conceptual illiteracy to stuff today too. And part of that owes the end of the Cold War. I I make the point again and again, and I'm sure it sounds like cantankerous old guy stuff, but it's not some like it's not some like old person nostalgia for like the way things used to be like at all. But like but you used to get um their guys of real ability used to go into public, like what's called public service, whether that's an appropriate moniker or not. You found some of the best and the brightest in applied sciences working on SDI. Like you found guys, who could have gotten, plum jobs at Goldman Sachs or whatever, like going to work, like in the State Department. Like you had guys who were like, American Brahmins, like James Baker, instead of kind of like globetrotting around, stacking up billions of dollars, they decided like we got to win the Cold War. So like, I'm going to be Secretary of State. Like you would never see anything like that today. Like government now is like a repository of like weirdos and like wannabes and like losers. So that's part of it. Like I make the point again and again, Elon Musk, if this was 40 years ago, like he'd be working on SDI. He'd be a guy like Jerry Pournelle, that's absent that kind of catalyst. And then, I mean, that's exactly what happened. Like rapidly, like immediately, like after the Warsaw Pact capitulated, we get like piggy Bill Clinton, like the pussy hounding buffoon who like plays a saxophone in Arsenio Hall and talks like fucking baby Huey. I mean, it's like there wasn't even like a lag time where you had some guy like Scowcroft or some guy, like Baker himself, or even like a guy like Dick Cheney, Dick Cheney is like a terrible person, but he's like a serious guy. But I mean, he didn't like covet like the presidency in anything other than a shadow role. So my point is that I mean, part of this is structural, but it's also it doesn't it's that I'll give it back to you in a minute because I realize this turned into a monologue. But that's part of like what took me back about wokeism. Like it's not that I mean wokeism is kind of over, but it kind of burned out as rapidly as it emerged, kind of in conceptual space. But it didn't kind of jar me because it was like fucking retarded or like obtuse as hell or like ridiculous or crazy. It's that it like wasn't workable. It was like a bunch of freaks like screaming at half the country about how evil they are. And like what exactly can you like structure out of that? What I mean? Like what's the end game? It's like, okay, if that's like cathartic for you, like whatever, but I mean that's not politics. That's some kind of like ritual catharsis. But at some point in kind of every epoch in the past, like people understood that like you don't substitute that for a policy. Like you can't. It doesn't lead to anything. And if there are situations where like Machiavellians say like, well, let's create like legislative gridlock, and then like because our opposition like doesn't have a pot to piss in terms of their mandate, or in terms of like a policy platform, we can like swoop in and say like, hey, we'll fix this. Look, we're reaching across the aisle. That's not what like wokeism was about. It was literally just like what I said. It was these like really, really fucking stupid and really disturbed and just really kind of like conceptually illiterate people just like saying like these are things we're mad about and like we hate half the country because they're mean or they don't respect the dignity of these kinds of alienation like self identities or it was just the rendering of some kind of like boogeyman that is straight out of kind of the cliche playbook of kind of half baked post Marxist polemic. Like it was very strange, man.
Well, and that's part of why I think that the Trump indictment is so weird is that it seems like, to be honest, it seems amateur hour. It seems like they can't resist. That it's like they want to get him. And they're almost kind of blinded by that kind of like animal hatred. And like what you're saying about the woke, like there's definitely a part of that I don't think, and I realize we're going to have to be, careful because of YouTube, but I don't think the people in charge, so to speak, are true believers in whatever you want to say woke is. But it's a useful tool. But when you see something like this, which is I don't remember the name of the attorney, but this guy from, Manhattan, that's obviously,
Bragg, is
like
that
that's,
it?
yeah, I think so. Yeah. But like, that's a relatively serious outfit, and the fact that they seem to be kind of captured by this. And look, I realize there's a cynical take, which is basically like, look, this guy wants to make a name for himself. He wants to be the guy that prosecuted Trump. He doesn't necessarily care if it sticks. There's probably something to that. But to me, and I see a lot of this coming, from the executive branch, but also, from this prosecutor, where it does just seem like amateur hour. Like, these
And
don't
he
seem like
seems not
serious
real
people.
bright, man. And like I mean, I was a lawyer. Like I'm not. I mean, that doesn't like being a lawyer doesn't mean like there's all kinds of like literal like fucking like morons or lawyers. Like I'm not saying like, oh, I've got insight, I'm smart because I was a lawyer. But I mean, I only raise that because like I have been around trial lawyers. I mean, I was all the time for some years, and yeah, this Bragg guy just seems like not very bright. Like at the end of the day, I'm not saying that just to like be funny or like rip on somebody who I've got contempt for. Like he just seems kind of stupid. And I guess if you're reading it in the most kind of charitable terms, like not charitable in like absolute terms, but saying it as like a Machiavellian tactic, if the idea is we're gonna tie Trump up with an indictment just so that he can't like either de jure or de facto, he just can't stand for election. Okay, but you're kind of guaranteeing you're just gonna like send like the MAGA voters over to Perry or not Perry, fucking Jesus, DeSantis. Um, I swear I'm not having a senior moment, but it's like I don't a DeSantis administration would in practical terms would probably look a lot like a Trump administration would. I think DeSantis is a neocon at base, and I think he's a terrible person. And I think if he had his way, there'd be some kind of massive escalation in the crusade against Russia. But that's it's neither tactically nor strategically possible right now. But also, um, the DeSantis is going to he's going to have to fall back on some pretty Trumpian rhetoric because he's not a particularly strong candidate. He's just not, and he comes off as kind of a nasty guy. Not I mean, no, I mean, like obviously, like no career politician is like a nice guy or comes off that way, but DeSantis comes off like a really kind of mean person. I'm like, okay, that sounds lame, but it's like, well, to you and me, or to like, people who are like plugged into stuff, but to the average like friggin' voter, like that makes a huge difference, man. He's not a good candidate, and it's kind of strange that they drafted him, like the GOP, money types and kingmakers, but they don't really have anybody else. But at the same time, people tell me I'm wrong on this, but the regime can't indefinitely just like spoof and fake elections like going forward, or they're just not going to have any mandate at all. Okay, the regime can't just pull out and say like, Joe Biden, just it overcame every indicator and just swept, swept every single jurisdiction he had to. That was dubious the first time, but twice in a row, and then moving forward, if that's just kind of like become the default setting, you're gonna have you're gonna have a presidency kind of perpetually that has no like real clout anymore, and where the rubber meets the road, that kind of thing matters. Okay, like a lame duck president can't really get done what the executive needs to get done in a presidential system. And in America, because America is not the UK, America is not the Bundesrepublik, America's not even France, which arguably has is the only kind of continental power that has like a truly like presidential system. But America like orbits around the executive, okay, and deciding like we're gonna basically like geld the office of the president as kind of like a proverbial area denial strategy, to keep like a Trump or a future Trump, from capturing a similar coalition. It's like, well, okay, but that's an entirely Pyrrhic victory. So I consider that to be a terrible strategy. But to your point, I don't even think these fools are like thinking that far ahead. I think a handful of them are, but they're not really the guys who who are orchestrating grand strategy. I think it's a bunch of people like that Bragg guy who like are not very bright. They kind of believe their own. These people like live in a proverbial bubble. I mean, it was telling to me in 2016. I was kind of re-engaging with the world, as like I've told you guys and stuff, and it was fascinating to me because that was the first election that was really interesting, really since '92, in my opinion. But it was like obvious to me that Trump was going to carry that. Not because Trump is a great campaigner. I mean, there's two things that was fascinating. Trump was building a genuine grassroots. He was building genuine grassroots momentum, and a lot of that came from the internet. Like that's totally true. It's not a myth. And he did not have a traditional like ground organization in the way that presidential candidates who are successful did. So that was like, a game changer. But it's also there's literally no possible scenario where like Hillary Clinton becomes president. Like she was like the most hated political figure of her generation. And the fact that you had these media weirdos and these freaks like these James Carville types like talking about like Hillary's this like viable candidate. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like people hate Hillary so much that the Bernie voters like went for Trump in Milwaukee. Like she's literally the most hated political figure of her generation. And if you're so deluded and you're so disengaged from kind of actual America, you can convince yourself of stuff like Hillary Clinton is like a really great like candidate. I mean, like who knows what the hell these people believe? That's like literally delusional. It's not a polemical point. Like it's insane. Like it a talking dog would have good odds against Hillary Clinton, or a ham sandwich would, like literally. But that's like the way these people think. Like they're like what they want to believe, or like there's no the fact value distinction is like totally like done away with. That's why like they're all about fact checking, which really is like whatever I want to believe. They like don't even keep up appearances that it's something else. It's just like, and this spills over into everything like they do. I mean, you can tell me I'm wrong, but it's like, well, you're not. If in 2016 you were sitting around saying Hillary Clinton is like a strong candidate, not just a strong candidate, but she's got this like across the aisle appeal. It's like, are you literally insane? Like, but that's again, like that's it's like these people like Scientologists almost. Like there's something very cultic and just like out delusional about like what they believe. But I realized that was a rant, but there's not a more kind of cogent way to characterize it, I don't think. But that's my take on it.
There's something in all of this that it seems like, and this is something that many people have said before, that they're sort of punishing Trump and punishing the chuds, that 70-some million Americans. They're essentially punishing them for denying, blue America eternal victory with Hillary Clinton, right? And it's sort of like it's sort of sour grapes. And so I'm genuinely curious, because the story of the last 3 years has been one, much in kind of like a rerun of the Clinton and then, the Obama terms, a weaponization of the judiciary against
Absolutely
the Trump bloc. And you mentioned this earlier, that it's like, well, okay, like if you take away, even a pretense of electoral legitimacy, right? A vast majority of, Republican Americans basically feel like, that they weren't given a fair shake. This happened, again with the midterms. And there does sort of come a point where it's like, well, like what is their end game, so to speak? Do they have an end game, or is it just essentially like a kid throwing a fit in a candy store? And what's especially interesting, in all of this is what will happen in the next presidential election. Because to be honest, I thought, and maybe this is just me, buying into kind of like, a basic way of thinking, but I would have thought that the correct play, quote unquote, was to allow a minor red wave in the House and the Senate, right? To essentially let off pressure from the pressure cooker. But it seems like that's not going to happen. And so I wonder if, is the new normal in America essentially this like god awful third world existence, where there essentially is the party of power, things just kind of like stop working. And I don't know, I don't really necessarily have a super cogent view of what that's going to be like, but I guess I don't know is like, have we seen a fundamental transformation in how politics works going forward?
I think so. I think so, and it's been in the running. I mean, this is a particular. There's the ideological aspect, and the bad faith, the fact that a majority of people in managerial roles or who covet those roles are bad faith actors. To your point, they're interested in just creating a homogenous and ideologically homogenous like managerial culture that locks out anybody who's not compliant or at least like nominally loyal to it. But even that aside, I make the point again and again, structurally America would be in trouble in terms of the way things are in terms of the way of government, okay? Because the regime you have is not this kind of like legacy regime of 1776. It was created by a couple of punctuated revolutions. That's not polemic. I mean, that's an accurate rendering and of events. And the regime that you and I live under, and basically the only regime that anybody remembers anymore, because like the Great Depression people have all like passed away. It's the house the New Dealers built. Okay, and that's a regime that basically was created to do two things. It was created to wage the anti-fascist crusade. It was created to make sure that another Great Depression could never happen by truly like integrating integrating the banking system first, like nationally and then globally, and tethering it to the federally guaranteed interests and things. But it's basically like the welfare warfare state of that Burnham talked about. Now, like whether you think, I'm not making some like libertarian argument, like whether that's a perennially or objectively like good or bad. It's tailored to do a very specific thing, okay? And post 1989, it's kind of an anachronism. Like it's not really suited to the 21st century, okay? Like in any way, shape, or form. Like it's not suited to fighting 21st century wars. It's not suited to kind of picking winners and losers in terms of keeping America competitive while also maintaining kind of the hegemony of the dollar in global trade. It's just not. It's a regime. And again, I'm not saying these are objectively like good things or laudable goals, but within the bounded rationality of what it's structured to do, it's not something that works in the 21st century. It's so there'd be problems anyway, and because of that or concomitant with that, but I think there's a causal relationship. Like I mentioned when we first went live, there's a talent drought, because like the most talented, capable men, they don't really want anything to do with government. Okay, like why would they? That's it's kind of a fool's errand and something people look down on. So all this stuff, all these circumstances is going to conspire to do two things, to create kind of a collapse of what remains of the consensus, or what was the consensus, and also it makes it kind of it makes the deep state kind of ripe for subversion, because like the people who do gravitate to it, they're going to be people who've got like a very partisan view of government, quad government, as some kind of positive good or some kind of essential thing, or as some kind of mechanism to impose some sort of ideological vision that's very much outside the mainstream, and not just outside the mainstream, but people have a very kind of hostile and punitive view of that mainstream, would view it as kind of a weapon, as you characterized it, to either out and out harm, people categorically who they think are oppressing them, or to try and socially engineer things they don't like, kind of out of, if not out of existence totally, because that may not be possible, like out of public spaces. So it's kind of a perfect storm of things. But that's why I'm always making the point to people that when they act like the regime is 10 feet tall, it's like, it's like even if it was more robust in terms of the as the Germans would have called it, the Mention material that constitutes it, and even if it was kind of more adept at realizing its objectives and the bounded rationality of its ambitions, it's just not, it's an anachronism as it's structured, and the historical process would kind of do away with it. Like you're not in 300 years, like some some kind of some kind of legacy version, some kind of legacy deteriorated diminished version of the United States of America will exist in 300 years, but it's not going to be like what exists now, and it's certainly not going to be anything like what existed 70 years ago. So I think these are important things to consider.
Yeah, that is something that is kind of encouraging in all of this. When we're watching our enemies make bad plays, and I don't say bad as in morally bad because that's kind of a given. I just mean within their own bounded rationality doing
Yeah,
these kind of
it's
stupid
dumb.
things.
Yeah, it's just
And
dumb. It's just
I'm
dumb.
exactly, yeah, and that's kind of hopeful, because if you had to pick to fight someone, I say this kind of jokingly all the time, but it's like, say what you will about Lenin and Stalin, they were evil guys, but like they weren't embarrassing,
No,
and a lot of these
no,
guys
they were
are
serious
embarrassing.
people, and that's that kind of lack of seriousness is like I tell people, it was jarring, man. Like um that's what really was remarkable in bad ways about the Clinton ascendancy, and you can't build enduring things on the backs of buffoons, or on the backs of guys who have developed a social identity around some like internet sex paraphilia, and who are mad at everybody. You can't I mean, there's just nothing there. Like even if somehow these people are kind of like conceal their true nature, and kind of finesse their enemies into a false sense of security, and by keeping up kind of the appearance of a of a willingness to compromise, like there's like nothing to this stuff. Like at the end of the day, you know like human societies have to have a point, and saying the point is to socially engineer out of existence any kind of spontaneous or organically occurring, like ethnocultural convention or practice, and we just demand that, like, there be no restriction on abortion, and we want like a bathhouse in every corner, and to just constantly talk about how we deserve to be like respected, based on these weird kind of sexual habits. Like nobody's no I mean there's just aside the fact that nobody's gonna like sacrifice and die if necessary to preserve that, there is no like that, even there's not even a that. I mean, it's kind of the absence of a conceptual horizon, like rather than just like a bad one. So I mean, there's nothing really to around. You can't like the vector of um of human societies at scale, like can't orbit around nothing. You know what I mean? That's why it's like, okay, and so I know people, especially people, have some kind of like vestigial attachment to the regime, or at least kind of like America as it's structured, that they're habituated to. They think that's like some horrifying prospect. I'm like, but why? Like this thing needs to die, and I good. I mean, me and my people will celebrate that. Like
Well,
we
this
want
is
nothing to do with
something
it.
this is something that because I've been reading through Imperium over the last couple days
That's
by
great.
Yaki,
Yeah, that always
and
makes me happy to hear people doing so.
he has this section basically attacking liberals who will say, like, oh, if you believe in a civilizational life cycle, you're a pessimist. And his point is like, well, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be a pessimist?
Yeah.
If I tell you, Thomas, like, hey, look, one day you're going to die, am I being a pessimist? No, I'm not. I'm just telling you a simple fact of reality. And to me, when I look at our state, it reminds me very much of, and I'm sure you've met this kind of person, someone who, by all rights should have been dead a long time ago. And they're kind of being kept alive as some kind of ghastly cyborg, like barely breathing. They've got a machine doing that for them, bleeding their entire, family dry of wealth. And obviously, I realize it's a difficult personal decision to make. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
But there is something kind of ghastly about something that just is kind of like holding on that long.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there was something grotesque about the late Soviet Union. Like it was almost like a horror movie or something. Like it reminded me of, like, it sounds corny, but you ever seen the movie The Dark Crystal? It's that like high fantasy where there's all these like creatures and they're like Muppets and animatronic stuff. There's like no actors in it. You ever seen it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. You know how like the ruling cast of this like dying planet. It's these bird creatures, but they're like decrepit as fuck because they're like ancient, but they're still like fighting with each other over who gets to be emperor. Like even as like the last emperor, he's like literally like rotting alive because he's so decrepit. There's something that was very on the nose and like Soviet like about that, like, and especially because that film came out in like around '82. It was like it wasn't corny. Like it was very much like reflected and kind of distilled symbolic terms, like a real phenomenon. But to Yagi's point too, even if you've got a robust, I'm always pointing out that Jeremy Bentham is a really kind of grotesque person, and it's like you read about the panopticon and you read about the kind of social engineering regime. It's basically the ideology of like a nursing home or like some kind of like very humane prison. Like it's like literally the most pointless society you could possibly imagine. Like why would this even occur to anybody? Like why? And even if it did, like, okay, fine. I can see maybe some kind of highly intelligent person or some theoretical type, the sort that I enjoy reading. Like coming up with it, but why would that represent some kind of good to you? Like how debased are you and kind of devoid of any kind of higher cultural instinct? If like to you, like it's like, yeah, as long as there's like endless food and like endless physical security and I can like defecate in like a clean environment, that's like heaven. I mean, like who thinks that way? But that's.
I got someone at my door. Give me like 2 seconds. We
can
cut this out. Yeah, sorry about that. There are pros and cons to living in a 100-and-some-year-old building. And
no, it's all good, man.
So
yeah,
sorry,
no.
So you were talking about kind of the Benthamite version of heaven, right?
Well, yeah, and it's what's like what's
your needs met.
What's peculiar, I mean, like we talked about before when we were talking about the origins of liberalism. The ontology of which owes a lot to Hobbes, which a lot of people don't recognize. And to me, I'm always making the point that Schmitt, the relationship of Hobbes to Schmitt, is kind of like that of Hegel to Marx. Schmitt really kind of turned Hobbes on its head. I mean, I'm not saying that punitively, but the Hobbesian ontology seems completely irredeemable, but Hobbes also posited, like an utterly absolutist conception of sovereignty that was, nakedly theological. So, I mean, it's more complicated than, his ideological descendants would allow, who, tend to invoke that paradigm for cynical purposes. But if the chaos in which Hobbes was situated, like, it makes sense. Okay. I mean, if you literally live in like the house of war, as like Muslims would characterize it, like war without end, like war without rational, constructive, outcome, like you're gonna be focused on the pragmatic. Okay, you're gonna be focused on, in immediate senses, like how do we resolve this so that civilization can be reestablished, or like the precursor to it at least, so that eventually some kind of cultured existence can reemerge. So that's the way to understand Hobbes if one wants to take a punitive view of his ontology. But in the case of somebody like Bentham, like that wasn't on the table at all. You're literally just talking about you're talking about this kind of like joyless bureaucrat, who is kind of overly fixated on sex and material comfort, like and has no like meaningful attachment to culture, and kind of and just views kind of the paradigm of government as some end in itself. There's something like really perverted about that. Like government's not some end in itself. And like you don't look at man as like this kind of like as this kind of like integer on like a game table or something, or like a symbolic variable or a symbolic object on like an abacus or something, and to take like delightful pleasure in like finding different ways to configure and organize like human lives at scale. And like there's something about liberalism that really attracts like a debased kind of like crummy human type. I mean, there just is. I mean, there's not a way to dress it up into something more dignified, because it lacks dignity.
Well, and
So I
I
mean
think
that's
that
why. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
and this kind of ties our multiple threads together here, that the regime is in a situation where it wants two things at once, right? Like it both wants to kind of like maximize along the lines of this woke religion, right? Which is basically exclusive to, like the MAGA coalition, which is exclusive to, kind of like normal, white guys in particular. And it also wants an international crusade against Russia, right? And I think what we've seen, because I've been kind of passively following this story of, declining recruitment, declining recruiting standards, is that you can't have both of those, at least explicitly. You can't demonize, the base that you need, as your warrior class. And when you combine that with what you've described as this like nursing home state, right? You're taking what's already a minority of your population, and essentially like putting them on, life support from day one, right? And it's just like, I'm not going to say like, we've got 5 years, we've got 10 years, but ultimately that's not a sustainable trend. If you sort of see what I'm
And
getting at.
no, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why well, yeah, that's all. I mean, Yaki gets into that too. Like the zenith of liberalism at scale as an international system is the Nuremberg system. It's declaring that warfare is quote illegal, and the arms of government is a police department with shoot to kill clearance at all times, that is enforcing the prohibition on warfare and on political activity. That's not, people aren't going to like die to be policemen enforcing the prohibition on war. They're not. People will die to prevent the ascendancy of world communism, but no matter how you characterize it, but that's a totally different thing existentially. So yeah, well, it's all the two. I mean, let's be honest here. I know that I get really sick of people claiming that anytime you say anything other than that, like Russia is falling apart at the seams, you're like, oh, that's a cope. It's like I'm not Russian. I have no connection to Russia. I don't know exactly what I'm coping with. But when if you believe that America is utilizing Ukrainians of all people as their proxies, as their like Janissary Corps, if you think that is something that like a truly strong state with the ability to project power in the way that a superpower does, is conducts things operationally, like you've got it completely twisted. Okay, it's a ridiculous proposition. This country, Zelensky's Ukraine, is like Somalia of the Urals, and like that's like that's your proxy element. It's like fuck out of here. It's not serious, and it's not sustainable.
So I'm curious. We're kind of coming up on on time, but we still got a little bit. If you had to, make a prediction about, where, on one hand, this, this case against Trump is going to go, and on the other hand, what the regime's attitude is towards Trump and his base going forward. Where do you think both of those will go?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think no matter what, Trump wins. I mean, if Trump gets convicted, Trump's a martyr. If Trump's acquitted, or if the complaint is dismissed, prior to a verdict being rendered by the trier of fact, Trump is still a martyr, and the regime looks both malicious and incompetent. Like I said, the only if reading in the light most charitable, if the end game is just to prevent Trump from standing for standing for election and contesting the in the 2024 primary, okay, maybe the regime wins then, because Trump's not going to run again in 4 years, but the mega coalition doesn't just evaporate like when Trump goes away, so that seems like a that seems like not a Pyrrhic victory, but it seems penny wise and dollar foolish writ large. It's hard to say. Can DeSantis win in a general election? Yeah, absolutely, but there's not elections anymore, and the Republicans just let this happen, like it, harvesting ballots perennially, like, and the if you have the ground organization to harvest more ballots, like totally unauthenticated ballots, of course, like you can just declare yourself the president, and the Republicans too. It's not even just a question of people being disgusted with these careers by like Mitch McConnell, like the Republican Party, if they're not the kind of final sort of test of their legitimacy, or rather their relevance, rather, maybe is a better way to characterize it. Like when they simply like when due process as per like elections was just like abolished, and like they didn't care. Like there was just like some nominal bitching about it, but they like didn't take any action to remedy that sort of gross overreach. I mean, that's when they cease being relevant, in my opinion. Like what will become of the Trump coalition? They're just going to increasingly secede from engagement with the election rituals, or what stands in now for election rituals, other than locally. Like this is, I think part of the silver lining is that this is breathing new life into, and robust life at that, into localism. But it's complicated, man. We should do another episode on it, frankly, just like on that topic.
That's one of the things, and Younger writes about this in The Forced Passage, where he essentially says that participation in the ritual of democracy is what gives the state its legitimacy.
100%.
And you can, especially in a situation when it's pointless, right? Where you will not be, procedural outcomes will be manipulated in such a way that you will not be allowed to make a difference. That, to be honest, like withdrawing your consent, it really does make a material difference, right? Because there is a point at which regimes lose the mandate of heaven. You can't just, once you've kind of lost that like X factor, the whole thing kind of falls apart at the seams. And
it's like I've always said, like if literally like nobody votes, or like nobody participates in the kind of faux voting ritual of, I mean, just like what kind of credibility do you have? Like I mean, under this system and the way things are configured, globally with developed countries, like it's like the the media can claim all they want that like Joe Biden is the greatest political figure who ever lived, despite the fact he's like a doddering freaking idiot. Like at some point, that is actually harmful, and people are like, "Well, it's just the hubris of the regime. They can say whatever they want." It's like, but they can't though, man, any more than like the Soviet Union could. Like again, people have this idea that like the government's like 10 feet tall. This stuff's not sustainable over time, man. Like if you abolish elections and like literally nobody takes the office of the presidency seriously anymore, like again, like the president no longer has the ability to be the kind of vector around which like policy orbits, and this stuff matters. Like it's not just a symbolic phenomenon.
And I
And
think that analogy of the late Soviet Union is kind of a useful one. Because we're kind of in a similar position, right?
yeah,
Like
and
we mouth a state religion no one believes. We're ruled by elderly freaks, and
yeah, and I mean it's like that's the point. It's so obvious. It's like, look, man, if there's literally nobody you can draft after you remove Trump from office other than Joe fucking Biden, like that's pathetic, man. Like Biden was a punchline, when he was 35 years old. Like the guy's a fucking clown. Like he always was. The
I don't
fact
know,
that now
Thomas. He's the most popular president in history.
Yeah, he
Apparated
outperformed
10
FDR,
10
Kennedy.
million votes out of nowhere. But
Yeah.
was,
They should put him out. If that's true, they should put him on Mount Rushmore because he's like literally like done the impossible. He's like literally the greatest politician who ever lived. Like it. But that's yeah. I mean the whole thing is crazy. But yeah, I maintain like hollowing out the office of the presidency, that just to deny it to the enemy, that is truly like a Pyrrhic victory in the American system. Again, like America's not the UK, America's not the Netherlands. The president's not. There's a chasm of difference between a U.S. president and like a prime minister, or even a chancellor, like in the modern Bundesrepublic. America truly is a presidential system. So but that's kind of a dense topic. But yeah, again, man, this was really dope. Thanks for hosting me, and I'm very, very stoked, man. This is the year anniversary of the Beaver mob, man, and I'd like to think I had some little part in like helping it be successful.
No, definitely, man.
This is very
did,
exciting, man. Legit. Like I'm not just being polite because you're my friend.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed being on the internet for the last year. It's been really fun. We've seen good growth in conversations like these, because I will say, like, you and I have done, I think this is our 10th or 12th, I can't quite remember, conversation we've done on my channel. And I don't know, I wouldn't keep doing this if I didn't think we were adding something. If I thought this was just a waste of time, I'd stop.
Yeah.
But it's not. We're getting good stuff out there, and it's been a little bit since the last time we talked. That's mostly just due to the fact that we've both been super busy. But I always enjoy having you on my channel, man. I appreciate it.
No, 100%, man. And yeah, we'll do this again soon.
So
and
if people want to find you, what's a good place for them to check you out, check out your work?
I mean, my permanent home is Substack. It's realthomas777.substack.com. It may seem like I've been inert lately. I'm busting my ass to get the channel launched, with fresh content and properly edited content, by the first week in May. We're reskinning the podcast to prepare for season 2. A lot of things are going to change there. I mean, just there's a lot of things changing. Okay, I mean, it's not. I'm not just like being inert. That's why there's been a delay on this week's Mind Phaser too. But for the time being, I'm on Twitter. They could nuke me at any time, and I'm gonna, as the channel launches, I'm gonna disengage from there and launch my own website. But you can find me on Twitter. Seek and ye shall find. I'm on Tgram. I'm on Instagram. But you can find links to all that stuff on my Substack, and that and the website when I launch it in the next couple of weeks is going to be like my permanent online home. So check us out, realthomas777.substack.com, and you can link to all our other shit from there.
Well, sure thing, man, and I really appreciate you coming on. As far as my
Likewise,
stuff,
man.
you guys know where to find me. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey, anywhere you listen to audio-only shows. This is kind of the start of, and I was talking to Thomas about this before we go live, season 2, right? Which is a little bit slower release schedule, no drop in quality, because of course we're always getting better. But expect some slight changes, to the format in the schedule. But other than that, we're continuing at full speed ahead. This episode is pre-recorded, and if you want to support the show, you can throw a little bit of money my way and get access to pre-recorded episodes early, like this one. If you want to support our sponsors, the links are down in the description. I really appreciate it. And to you guys at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.